These moments in history where the light of truth just seems to bend, it refracts, and it leaves behind nothing but these really intricate shadows and, well, just doubt.
Hmm.
We're talking about cold cases today, but not just any cold cases. We're looking at these specific mysteries that have this almost agonizing resistance to being solved.
Yeah, the ones where the answer feels like it's perpetually just
Yeah.
one step away.
Exactly. One piece of evidence, one witness, just
It's
out of reach.
And that psychological pull you're talking about, it really speaks directly to our need for order, for a
Yeah.
narrative that makes sense.
We want closure.
We crave it.
Mm.
When a tragedy happens, you expect there to be accountability, a motive, a clear explanation.
Yeah.
And when those things are withheld, whether it's by, some calculated secrecy or just the limits of an investigation,
The story just grows.
gains this incredible cultural longevity. We, as the observers, we just feel compelled to keep going back to those gaps in the story, hoping that this time maybe we can finally fill them.
And that is exactly our mission for this deep dive. We're really analyzing the architecture of the unresolved. We've gone through a huge stack of sources, articles, forensic reviews, research papers, some of them spanning over a century.
Right.
And we've synthesized 4 very distinct, historically significant cases that all share this common, maddening thread, really tantalizing evidence that just has never led to a conviction, or at least not to a definitive, universally accepted closure.
We're charting a course through some profound human darkness here. We're going to be examining the methodology, the forensic details, and also the ethical questions that these mysteries forced on communities and, on the legal systems of their time.
We are diving into the century-old horror of the Villisca Axe murders, a case that just shattered the American ideal of a safe home.
Mm.
Then we'll explore the Somerton Man, an identity completely lost to code, maybe to espionage, right in the shadow of the Cold War.
And after that, the dark waters surrounding the death of Hollywood icon Natalie Wood, a tragedy that's just so complicated by fame and by shifting stories.
And finally, we're going to confront the myth of the single predator in the Boston Strangler case. These are 4 shadows that, they still fundamentally alter the historical record.
And to really understand the lasting impact of these cases,
Yeah.
you have to appreciate the context, the technology, the society in which they happened. So we're going to begin with the oldest case, one that delivered a kind of calculated terror that completely destroyed the illusion of safety in rural America.
Okay, let's unpack that.
Yeah.
This idea of calculated terror, starting way back in 1912. This is before we had standardized fingerprinting, before the concept of an organized serial killer was even a thing in law enforcement.
Right.
And then you have the nightmare of Villisca, Iowa.
Villisca was, and all the sources really emphasize this, it was the absolute epitome of small-town, quiet, rural life.
A place where people didn't lock their doors.
Exactly. Doors were left unlocked.
Mm.
And that context is what makes the crime of June 10th, 1912, so profoundly traumatic. This wasn't some crime of passion or a spontaneous, chaotic act of violence. This was a methodical, organized slaughter.
Against an entire family and their guests.
While they slept, inside what was supposed to be the sanctuary of their own home.
8 victims killed that night. You have Josiah and Sarah Moore, their 4 children, Herman, Catherine, Boyd, and Paul, and then 2 young overnight guests, the Stillinger sisters, Lena and Ina.
All of them bludgeoned to death. And what's so critical, like you said, is the methodology. This wasn't a frenzy.
Not at all.
That's the key distinction. The sources point again and again to this chilling evidence of the killer's, what they call calm deliberation.
Okay, so what's the first sign of that?
First, the weapon. It was Josiah Moore's own axe. It was found leaning against the wall right outside the parents' bedroom.
So using the victim's own tool, what does that suggest?
Well, it suggests either profound convenience, like an opportunity just presented itself, or something more intimate, an almost familiar knowledge of the household.
But the detail that really sticks with you, the truly indelible forensic and psychological detail, is in the preparation, the staging of the scene.
Yes. The killer moved through that house with this dark purpose, securing the scene before or during the act.
What do you mean by securing?
Every window shade was pulled down. And critically, every single reflective surface mirrors, windows, even glass on picture frames was covered with fabric or clothing that was just found in the home.
That's bizarre. That immediately suggests a psychological drive that goes way beyond just murder.
It does. and investigators have debated the purpose for over a century. Was it some kind of dark ritual,
Hmm.
maybe to prevent the victim's souls from seeing the killer?
Or something else.
Or from a criminal psychology perspective, maybe it was a manifestation of the killer's own pathology, a need to avoid their own reflection, to avoid witnessing their own dark actions. The avoidance of self-reflection during a crime like this is a really strong marker for dissociative behavior. Or, on the other hand, extreme control.
And then there's the detail that just solidifies the absolute coldness of the act. The fact that the killer stayed. They didn't just kill and run.
They absolutely lingered. The evidence showed the killer ate a meal in the kitchen.
What?
Yes. A plate of uneaten food was there, and a bowl of bloodied water was found, likely used to wash up. And then they spent considerable time in the home, maybe for hours, before leaving around dawn.
That implies a stunning lack of fear. No urgency at all.
It suggests a killer who wasn't fleeing the scene of a chaotic crime, but was, completing a grim operation, and then just taking up a temporary, unhurried residence in the home.
This level of deliberation, it just screams organized predator, long before that term was even coined. And yet, despite all of this evidence, the investigation was just paralyzed immediately. Why? What were the roadblocks in 1912?
The roadblocks were both structural and technological. I mean, in 1912, investigations relied almost entirely on local sheriffs, who were often just completely ill-equipped to handle a mass homicide.
So no specialized units or anything like that?
No. They did use some early forensic photography, some basic blood analysis, but they lacked standardized fingerprinting, let alone DNA evidence, obviously. They had to rely almost entirely on witness testimony and circumstantial leads.
And that must have led to just massive amounts of chaos in the investigation.
Precisely. You ended up with multiple plausible suspects.
Yeah.
There was a man named Frank Jones, a state senator, and a business rival of Josiah Moore. He was actually tried but acquitted.
Okay.
Then, maybe most fascinatingly, you have Reverend George Kelly. He was a traveling preacher with a known history of sexual deviancy, and he had given a sermon on the topic of suffering the night before the murders.
That's chilling.
It is, and Kelly actually confessed years later, but then he recanted it. The lack of hard, verifiable forensic data just meant the investigation was so easily derailed by red herrings, by political influence, by conflicting local theories.
And the house itself, it's still standing today. It's like a century-old physical monument to this unresolved trauma. Resisting resolution because the tools needed to solve it just didn't exist at the time.
It's the ultimate case of the truth being locked in a time capsule. It's a century of secrecy, preserved by the limitations of early 20th century police work.
Okay, so now let's jump forward half a century. We go from the quiet terror of Villisca to the urban panic that completely seized Boston in the early 1960s.
Boston Strangler.
A Boston Strangler. This was terror calculated not by meticulous staging inside a single home, but by shattering the sense of security of apartment living across a huge city.
Between 1962 and 1964, 13 women were murdered in their apartments across Boston and its surrounding areas. And this series of crimes was terrifying because it felt so random, so intimate, and just profoundly uncontrollable.
And the killer, or killers, as we'll get to, they seem to get inside without forcing doors.
Which suggests either deception, posing as a maintenance man or something, or that the victims willingly opened the door to their attacker.
And the victims, their ages ranged dramatically, from 19 years old all the way up to 85. That huge variation in the victim profile is what fundamentally terrified the public. It meant no one felt safe.
Right. There was no specific target demographic you could point to and say, well, that's not me.
But the methods, they did have some elements of consistency, right?
They did. Victims were sexually assaulted, and all of them were strangled, usually with their own silk stockings or scarves. That consistency is what led the press and the initial investigators to conclude they were searching for one single sadistic predator.
But here's where the complexity really begins. This is where the sources highlight the central contradiction of the whole case. The evidence itself suggests that there might be multiple perpetrators.
That's right.
What were the specific variations that argued against a single strangler?
Well, if you look closely at the initial FBI profiling attempts, they noted really significant variations in the physical evidence and the modus operandi, the MO.
Like what?
For instance, some victims were sexually assaulted, but others were not. In some of the cases, the bodies were staged or posed in a specific way. In others, they were just left immediately after the murder. The level of force, the precision, it all varied.
So some investigators didn't buy the single killer theory from the start?
The early belief among certain experts was that they were looking at a series of independent crimes, not the work of one single highly refined serial killer.
Yet the police, the media, and this desperate public, they created the narrative of the single, terrifying villain. Why was that narrative so compelling to everyone?
Because a single villain, even a terrifying one, is conceptually manageable. You can wrap your head around it.
It's one monster, not monsters everywhere.
Exactly. The idea that 12 or 13 women were murdered by separate, unrelated people all operating at the same time in the same city is it's too chaotic. It's too frightening for a society to process. The public desperately needed a name, a face, and a single motive to restore a sense of order.
And then they got a name, Albert DeSalvo. He confessed in 1965.
And DeSalvo provided these details of the crime scenes that were incredibly compelling. Details that he claimed only the killer could possibly know, like the placement of a specific object in a room or specific things he said to the victims.
So for many people, that was it. Case closed.
For many in law enforcement and for the public, absolutely. The narrative order was restored.
But legally, this closure was basically a mirage. DeSalvo was never actually tried for the Strangler murders.
And this is such a crucial legal gap in the story. DeSalvo was already facing conviction for a series of earlier, unrelated sexual assaults. They called him the Green Man.
Right.
Prosecutors were afraid that trying him for the Strangler murders, based only on a confession and circumstantial evidence, could somehow jeopardize the convictions they already had for the assaults. So he was sentenced for the assaults, not the murders. And then he was killed in prison in 1973.
Which raises these profound questions about criminal psychology. I mean, why would you confess to a series of high-profile murders if you didn't commit them, especially when you're already facing life in prison anyway?
It speaks to the psychological motive of notoriety. Some investigators have hypothesized that DeSalvo learned those specific crime scene details from the real killer, or maybe killers, while they were all in custody together.
So he just co-opted their stories.
Potentially. By confessing, he gets to seize the spotlight. He controls the narrative. He transforms himself from, a minor sexual assailant into the defining urban terror of the entire era. It's an act of pure ego, leveraging the public's desperation for a single explanation.
So you have the official narrative fighting against the forensic reality. And this is where modern science finally steps in, decades later, to give us a partial but still incomplete answer.
In 2013, investigators used advanced DNA analysis on evidence that had been preserved from the rape of the very last known victim, Mary Sullivan. The results provided a definitive match to Albert DeSalvo. It confirmed he was, at the very least, involved in that specific murder.
Okay, that's a huge shift. But it still doesn't solve the core mystery, does it?
It doesn't, not at all. While it proves DeSalvo was involved in one case, it doesn't preclude the possibility of other people being involved in the remaining 12. The central question is still there. Did one man commit all 13 murders, just benefiting from an era of fragmented investigations and a desperate public?
Or did multiple unrelated predators exploit the widespread fear, allowing DeSalvo's ego-driven confession to just cement the myth of the singular strangler?
Exactly. Even with modern DNA, we're left with this massive shadow hanging over the majority of the cases.
That brings us to our next enduring shadow. And this one shifts the focus so dramatically. We're moving from the act of terror to the ultimate puzzle of identity, of secrecy. We're going halfway across the world to Australia in the post-war era.
The Somerton Man.
The Somerton Man.
The contrast here is just stark. This mystery isn't defined by violence or methodology. It's defined by meticulous, intentional erasure.
So set the scene for us.
December 1st, 1948, Somerton Beach, in Adelaide, Australia. A well-dressed man is found dead, lie on the sand near the water's edge.
And the scene itself was quiet, almost dignified. But the investigation immediately hits a brick wall. What were these initial, almost unbelievable roadblocks?
The first roadblocks were the intentional absence of any identification and the failure to establish any cause of death, even after a really extensive forensic examination.
So they couldn't figure out how he died?
No. The man was well-built, in excellent physical condition. He was wearing a suit. But his pockets only had minor items: a used bus ticket, some gum, cigarettes, and, crucially, a tiny, tightly rolled-up scrap of paper.
And the really meticulous detail, the thing that makes this case so unique, is the obfuscation of his identity.
Indeed. Investigators found that every single label, from his suit jacket to his tie to his underwear, had been carefully, painstakingly cut or ripped out.
So this wasn't accidental?
No, this was not wear and tear. This was calculated self-erasure. His dental records were useless because he didn't match any existing files in Australia, Britain, or America. His fingerprints led absolutely nowhere.
This level of intentional anonymity set against the backdrop of 1948, I mean, that's the very beginning of the Cold War.
Exactly.
It immediately catapulted all the theories into the realm of espionage.
That geopolitical context is absolutely vital. Why would someone go to such extreme lengths to erase their entire existence unless they were involved in, state secrets? The lack of identification elevates the death from just a tragic incident to a potentially state-sponsored murder or suicide, tying it to intelligence operations where identity is completely expendable.
But then the clues started to appear, and they weren't typical detective clues. They were cryptic, almost literary. Tell us about Tamam Shud.
That small scrap of paper, the one found in his fob pocket, it contained just two words, Tamam Shud. It's Persian. It means ended or finished. And this phrase was the absolute key to unlocking the mystery's next layer.
Okay, so let's connect this to the cultural weight of that text. It was traced back to a very rare edition of the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam.
The Rubaiyat is a collection of 11th century Persian poems, or quatrains. They're deeply philosophical. They focus heavily on destiny, on fatalism, the ephemeral nature of life, and this idea of seizing the day, carpe diem.
So finding a fragment that means finished from that specific text on a man who has meticulously erased his entire life.
It turns the whole scene into this high-stakes, deeply personalized, dramatic exit. Or a coded message of ultimate finality.
And the mystery just got deeper when the actual book was found, right? Thanks to a public appeal.
Yes. The book was found in the back of an unlocked car parked near the beach. And in the back of the book, there was a section where the phrase Tamam Shud had been torn out. It was a perfect match.
But that wasn't all that was in the book.
No. It contained two other vital elements, a handwritten phone number and a 5-line block of cryptic capital letters that, to this day, remains undeciphered.
So the book itself is like the Rosetta Stone for this case, but the language is still alien to us. The code MRGAB, DIDD, and so on it has resisted decades of attempts at decryption.
And this is where the Somerton man case truly becomes a legend. I mean, whether he was a spy or just an ordinary man, he left behind this highly structured, organized message that was intended to be hidden, or maybe understood by only one other person. The very existence of the code suggests calculation, structure, and a purpose for his death beyond just simple natural causes.
And the phone number that led to a woman, a local nurse named Jo Thompson, or Jestin, as she was sometimes called. And this is where the theory splits into Cold War spy versus unrequited love.
When the police interviewed the nurse, she claimed not to know the man. However, witnesses noted that she had a visible shock reaction. She seemed very reluctant to even look at the plaster bust they'd made at the deceased man's face.
Which created two powerful competing narratives.
Exactly. The spy theory argues that he was eliminated because his identity was compromised and the nurse was his handler or his contact. The unrequited love theory posits that he was driven to suicide or met a tragic end over a relationship with this woman, and the code was a final hidden message just for her.
But both theories require this extreme measure of total anonymity.
They do.
And what's so fascinating is how modern science finally tried to provide an answer after 74 years. The 2022 DNA twist.
Right. In 2022, after the remains were exhumed, researchers analyzed DNA that was extracted from hairs found embedded in that plaster bust. And they claimed, through some really sophisticated genealogical work, to have identified him as Carl Charles Webb, an electrical engineer from Melbourne.
That was a monumental headline. It seemed like it was the final piece of the puzzle.
It seemed like it. But it comes with the inevitable cold case caveat, right? The debate on accuracy and conclusiveness.
Of course.
Absolutely. While identifying the name is a massive breakthrough, it doesn't solve the motive mystery. The debate now centers on why an electrical engineer would erase his entire life, carry around the Rubaiyat code, and use the methods of a high-level intelligence operative. We may know who he was, but we still don't know why he was on that beach or what those cryptic lines meant.
So modern tech can reconstruct an identity erased by time.
But it can't always decipher a secret hidden by intent.
We shift now from intentional self-erasure to a tragedy where the exact opposite was true. Excessive visibility, wealth, fame. A case where the narrative of accident was just constantly undermined by forensic contradictions and, well, shifting testimonies.
We're talking about the mysterious death of Natalie Wood. Thanksgiving weekend, November 1981. The scene is the yacht Splendor, moored off Catalina Island. And the people involved are pure Hollywood inner circle. Natalie Wood, her husband Robert Wagner, the actor Christopher Walken, and the boat's captain, Dennis Davern.
That setup alone, confined quarters, high tension, immense celebrity, it was just a recipe for intense scrutiny.
It was.
And the initial official finding was quick. Accidental drowning. Wood was 43. She was found in the water, wearing a nightgown and a down jacket.
The initial account stated that she likely slipped while trying to secure the dinghy, which was reportedly banging against the hull of the yacht. The toxicology report also noted she had a blood alcohol level of 0.14%, so legally intoxicated, and that was compounded by the presence of motion sickness and pain medication.
But this seemingly straightforward narrative immediately crashed into the established facts of Natalie Wood's life.
Right. The first and most profound discrepancy was her widely documented lifelong debilitating fear of dark or open water,
Hydrophobia.
a severe case of it. The idea that someone with this phobia would venture out onto the deck alone, in the dark, in an intoxicated state, to deal with a minor boat issue, it just strained credulity, and it immediately fueled a lot of public skepticism.
And the physical evidence suggested something far more violent than a simple slip occurred. Let's talk about the specific forensic details of her injuries.
The autopsy found numerous bruises on her body, on her arms, her face, her legs. And importantly, these were identified as premortem injuries, meaning they happened before she entered the water.
So they weren't just scrapes from a fall.
No, not the kind you'd get from a simple fall from the dinghy. They suggested a struggle or a physical altercation. And this completely shifted the perspective from a tragic accident to a violent incident that happened right before the drowning.
And the environment on the yacht, it sounds like there was intense conflict. Reports indicate there was growing tension aboard the yacht that whole weekend, specifically between Wagner and Walken.
Allegedly over Wood's career decisions, yes. The underlying context was volatile. Wagner consistently defended the accidental slip narrative. He stated that when he went to bed after an argument he had with Walken, Wood was already gone.
But the crucial conflicting testimony came years later from the boat's captain, Dennis Davern.
Davern's account was the absolute game changer. He initially backed up Wagner's version of events, but he later claimed he had lied to investigators back in 1981.
And his new testimony?
His subsequent crucial testimony stated that he heard Wood and Wagner arguing fiercely just before she disappeared, and that Wagner specifically told him not to call the Coast Guard when they realized she was missing, which suggests a cover-up, or at least a desperate delay.
So you have this clash between the celebrity defense, the accidental slip, and the physical evidence, combined with the captain's later admission. It created this untenable ambiguity.
And because of the high-profile nature of the case, the public doubt, it never truly faded.
That sustained public and media pressure years after the fact, that's what eventually forced this rare legal reckoning, right? The case was officially reopened in 2011.
It was.
Why is the reopening itself so legally significant?
It's a signal that the initial investigation was considered insufficient. The LA County Coroner's Office then took the extraordinary step of reclassifying her cause of death in 2012. They changed it from accidental drowning to drowning and other undetermined factors.
Which is a very rare move for a decades-old case.
Extremely. It acknowledges that the original finding was unreliable and that external factors, the bruises, the argument, couldn't be ruled out as contributing to her death.
And that move paved the way for the most significant development in recent years. Robert Wagner being named a person of interest in 2018.
Being named a person of interest suggests that investigators, looking at all the cumulative evidence, the reclassified cause of death, the captain's later testimony, the forensic detail of the bruises, they believe there is substantial reason to suspect foul play, or that, at the very least, a negligent act during an altercation led to her drowning.
But he's never been charged.
Never been charged, and he maintains his innocence to this day.
The lasting shadow of the Natalie Wood case is really defined by these ethical questions, isn't it? I mean, how does celebrity status and immense wealth influence an initial investigation? And how difficult is it to achieve any kind of justice when the opportunity for a definitive resolution slipped away that night in 1981, leaving only these dark waters of suspicion decades later?
So we've now spanned 7 decades of history. We've examined 4 completely distinct cold cases. And when you synthesize all these sources, the common theme isn't really the crime itself. It's the limitations, technological, legal, and psychological, that allowed these shadows to persist for so long.
Right. Let's start by comparing the investigative timelines. The huge leap in technology, or in some cases, the lack of it. We go from 1912 in Villisca, where the police were practically, flying blind, relying on Pinkerton agents and basic observation.
To the 1948 Somerton Man, where the intentional erasure of identity completely neutralized the forensic tools of the era. They had to rely instead on physical artifacts and cryptic text analysis. Then you have to jump 70 years to modern high-resolution DNA sequencing just to get a partial name.
The Somerton Man case is a perfect illustration of how human intent can outwit technology for
It
generations.
really is.
Then you have the Boston Strangler era in the 1960s. That case forced law enforcement into these early attempts at pattern recognition and psychological profiling. But the lack of standardized, computerized sharing of information just meant that these fragmented local agencies really struggled to connect the dots across different jurisdictions.
And finally, Natalie Wood in the 1980s. The initial focus there was on rapid toxicology reports and witness accounts, but the influence of celebrity and wealth seemed to skew the initial findings towards accident. That case required decades of persistent legal and public pressure to force investigators to finally acknowledge the evidentiary contradictions.
The common thread, as we've talked about, is that tantalizing feeling that the truth is just out of reach. In every single one of these cases, one crucial element is missing. The identity of the Villisca killer is still elusive. The decryption of the Somerton Code is unsolved.
The full specific truth behind DeSalvo's confession is incomplete.
And the precise events leading to Natalie Wood's reclassified death are still contested.
Let's delve a bit deeper into the criminal psychology across this spectrum. The secrecy, the motivation. You can contrast the cold deliberation of the Villisca killer, the methodical cleaning, the eating, the lingering. It all suggests a deeply controlled internal pathology, possibly a quiet, local individual.
With the Somerton Man, his motivation, whether it was geopolitical or romantic, was defined by this calculated anonymity. His goal wasn't terror, it was self-erasure and secrecy. The act was so highly structured, meant only for a select audience or for some future decoding.
And then contrast both of those with the really complex psychology of the Boston Strangler case, particularly the role of Albert DeSalvo. His confession introduces the motive of notoriety.
He was exploiting the cultural moment.
He absolutely was. He understood that the public needed a single villain, and he was more than willing to seize that role, even if it meant confirming a future of incarceration and ultimately death.
It's a profound psychological twist. Justice is supposed to seek truth, but DeSalvo's confession was this manipulative performance. It was designed to serve his own psychological need for fame and public definition, regardless of the ultimate facts of the other 12 murders.
And this leads us directly to the cultural influence and the legal gaps. The media machine, especially in the 60s and 80s, it just amplified the public's need for simplicity. In the Strangler case, the media created and sustained the myth of the singular figure. And as the sources note, that influenced the very direction of the investigation.
Potentially leading investigators away from the much more chaotic reality of multiple predators.
Right. And the influence of media attention on a high-profile figure like Natalie Wood meant that her case could never truly be closed simply by the initial questionable accident ruling. Persistent scrutiny ensured that the legal system had to revisit the evidence decades later.
The societal need for narrative closure, in short, it often just overwhelms the scientific or legal reality of investigative gaps.
It does.
So let's engage with some critical thought experiments, some what-ifs, based on the constraints and details we've talked about. And these aren't just idle speculations, they're serious explorations of the legal and cultural consequences if just one piece of the puzzle had fallen differently.
Okay.
What if the Somerton Man's cryptic code had been solved immediately in 1948?
Wow. If that code, those 5 lines of letters, had been solved, let's say within 48 hours, it would have instantly provided irrefutable clarity on the motive.
How so?
Well, if it was a geopolitical code, the Australian and U.S. intelligence communities would have been immediately and overtly engaged. The case would have transformed from a local police matter into a huge international spy incident. If it was a personal message related to the nurse, it would have immediately confirmed the unrequited love theory, likely leading to an immediate legal investigation into her or her family for potential poisoning or, negligent homicide. The entire context would have shifted, resolving the mystery of why he died, even if the method of death remained a question.
Okay, what if the Villisca killer hadn't stayed to eat that night or hadn't covered the mirrors?
That stay, the eating, the covering of the mirrors, that is the single greatest psychological marker we have of the killer's cold deliberation and control. If he had just fled immediately, the perceived motive might have leaned heavily toward a robbery gone wrong, or just a chaotic intrusion. It would have confused investigators even more.
But because he lingered.
Because he lingered and showed that quiet control, it points to a deeply personal or ritualistic dimension to the crime. Without those details, the psychological profile becomes much less distinct. And the political and local suspects, like Jones and Kelly, they might have been eliminated much sooner because they didn't fit that behavioral profile, leaving the case even colder than it already is.
And finally, the ultimate legal what if. What if Albert DeSalvo had been tried for all 13 Strangler murders before his death in 1973? Maybe due to a different prosecutorial strategy.
Legally, the public would have gotten its closure, a conviction for all 13 murders. However, given the varying MOs and the later DNA evidence that links him conclusively to only one of the victims, that legal closure would have always been profoundly undermined by forensic doubt.
So you'd have a complete paradox.
A complete paradox. A legally resolved case that, intellectually and scientifically, remains a deep mystery. It would still be haunted by the specter of other killers who would have gone completely free. That scenario would have cemented the narrative myth, but it would have fundamentally failed the search for the comprehensive truth.
These four enduring shadows, they teach us not just about the horrific nature of crime, but about the fundamental limitations of human justice when it's faced with calculated secrecy or technological gaps or just overwhelming societal pressure to find a simple answer. They show us how the power of a narrative can both define and ultimately obscure the truth.
And for you listening to this, gaining knowledge quickly but thoroughly means accepting that the unanswered questions are just as crucial and often more informative than the confirmed facts. These mysteries resist resolution because they involve human elements, manipulation, secrecy, cultural bias that defy simple classification and force us to confront the boundaries of what we can ever truly know.
Indeed. We're left to continually wonder about those final, fatal moments. And perhaps the most provocative thought to leave you with is this profound contrast between the detailed public life of Natalie Wood, a person known intimately to millions, and the erased life of the Somerton man, who took these extraordinary measures to be rendered a complete nobody.
Our societal obsession with these unsolved deaths, whether they involve the anonymous or the famous, it tells us something really important about our intrinsic need for closure, for order in a world that is fundamentally chaotic. And when justice fails to provide that ending, the myth endures forever, ensuring that those final crucial details will continue to be sought by generations to come.